I'm Randy Lewis, and this is Wanda Lewis. Kerry and Lisa Boren are here, and we're going to do a little bit of history of how we got into doing history. So anyway, with that, we'll let Lisa lead off.
Hi, I'm Lisa Boren, and I've been married to Kerry Ross Boren, for 36 years, and he's a pretty wonderful guy. But the amazing thing was that when we met, I just couldn't believe that he was a writer and had done the amazing things that he had done in his life. And I've since learned better. He's a fabulous writer, and over, year after year, more and more people have really enjoyed reading the history that he writes about, and the history that is recorded so that it's not lost to future generations. And it doesn't matter whether it's on the gold mines in the Uinta Mountains in the state of Utah, or whether it's about Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch and the historical things about that, to European history that he's written about, to even LDS history that he's written about. So he's pretty amazing, and I'm hoping that this short missive will capture that and just what he's leaving behind as a legacy to future generations.
Well, I got into history, I think, because of the place I lived. I was born in Green River, Wyoming in 1941, and our ranch was across the state line into Utah. And we lived in a valley where time had sort of stood still. There was a great many of the old timers still carried guns, and history was all around us. We lived in such a historical region. So much history happened in the area where I grew up. And I think I got initiated into it when I was in the Cub Scouts. We had a fireside down in Sheep Creek Canyon, and they invited some of the old timers from the region to tell us stories. And there was Mark Hansen, Tom Welch, a number of old timers that I was familiar with around the area, Tom Jarvie, and these were all old timers who had seen the Old West. And Tom Welch had ridden with the Wild Bunch. And so we were sitting around the campfire listening to these stories, and suddenly Tom Welch got up from the fire and walked around to where I was sitting and towered over me. He was a man about 6'4", very huge, muscular build, and I'd heard stories about him, one of which was my grandfather, Willard Schofield, had herded sheep up on the mountains, and Tom Welch had led the cattlemen up there and sort of fired upon my grandfather. And so my granddad had told me about Tom and how that had happened. So I'd always avoided him. Now here he was standing over me at the fireside, and he reached down and grabbed me by the hand. And I was shocked, to say the least. And he shook my hand firmly, and he said, "Now, son, you just shook the hand of the man that shook the hand of Jesse James." And that sort of instilled history in me. I was fascinated by that and never forgot it.
So there's a lot more to his story. Even though he was around these Western men who had been sometimes members of the Wild Bunch and had assisted the various outlaws, his own two grandfathers were involved with the outlaws. His grandfather, Schofield, often took food in to Butch Cassidy and the gang. And his other grandfather, William Coleman Boren, was a sometimes member. He actually helped rob a bank, no, a train. I'm sorry, a train in Wyoming. And he's captured in one of the famous photos with the Wild Bunch. And so both of these gentlemen knew Butch, but more than that, there was a family connection in terms of one of his grandfathers was raised with the Parker family. She was actually farmed out from her family, being one of the eldest children, to help raise Butch Cassidy's brothers and sisters. So there was a lot of connections there. So it goes a lot more deeper than just the surface history of him growing around these amazing people in that time and place. It actually had to do with the family connections that his own family had with Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch.
My grandfather Schofield had grew up in Beaver, Utah, and knew Butch before they moved up to northern Utah. And my grandfather, William Boren, rode with the Wild Bunch. He actually handled most of their horse relays, and he kept ranches where they could stop and get fresh horses. But in 1900, his wife was on her deathbed, and my grandmother, and he didn't have the money to even pay the doctor, and the doctor wouldn't come without the money. So he finally stepped across the line and helped Butch rob a train to get the money they needed. And he was in the famous Tipton train robbery in Wyoming. And they escaped through Browns Park. He was with Tom Welch. Tom got shot in the hip, and my grandfather had to help him to get as far as Browns Park. And they holed up in a cave in Krause Canyon, and Mary Krause, who was kind of the nurse from Browns Park, took care of everyone. She came up and took care of Tom's wound. And in the course of it, she took a goose feather and she ran it through the bullet wound in his hip and out the other side to clean it out. And then she laid that bloody feather next to him. So some years later, after Tom had healed up and took some of the money from the bank robbery or the train robbery, he bought a hotel and bar in Green River, Wyoming, and he named it the Red Feather Bar in remembrance of his activity with the Wild Bunch. So my grandfathers on both sides had a great deal to do with Butch in his early years, and then connected with him again in later years. When my grandfather, William Boren, died in a car accident in 1924 in Vernal, two men showed up at his funeral, and they put a wreath on his grave that said, "Our pal." And my uncle told me years later that had been Butch Cassidy and Elzaleh traveling through the country at that time. Shortly before that, my cousin had told me that Butch and Elza had come to town earlier, and that one of the reasons Granddad Boren was in the accident is that he was driving from the ranch in Mazer into Vernal City and to meet with them. And he was on his way home that night when he slipped off a bridge and into a canal and ended his life. So my family's always been connected heavily with Butch, and I learned new things about it all the time.
He has an amazing connection with a lot of the outlaw families. He's interviewed many of their descendants. He started a historical type of a society or something it was the University of
Called the
State.
National Center for Outlaw and Lawman History at Utah State University.
And he was able to gather a lot of the descendants of these outlaws or family members in order to recreate some of the experiences as well as to capture the history of the families.
Yeah, at our initiation ceremony, we had Lula Parker Bettinson, Butch Cassidy's sister, two of Matt Warner's children, Joyce and Boyle Warner, and
Marvelade Murdoch.
Marvel Leigh Murdoch, who was Elsa Leigh's daughter, and a number of others. We had Cowboy Joe Marsters, one of the last members of the Wild Bunch, and we even had the head of Pinkertons at the ceremonies, and he became a board member there. So it was interesting to put them all together in one place. Marvel Murdoch, very sweet lady, Elsa Leigh's daughter, a friend of mine for many years. She was such a sweet lady, and at night at the ceremony she surprised everyone. Each one of them got up in turn, stood before the microphone to tell a story about their connections.